Well, welcome to the dining table, not the kitchen table, which is short, sharp, and snappy, but this is a longer meal. And we have a wonderful dinner guest, Professor John Lennox. Now, for those of you who've been on another planet and don't know who he is, I'm going to ask you, John, first of all, welcome. Just explain briefly who you are.
I am a retired professor, essentially, although I'm as active as I've ever been. But for the last 20 or so years, I've been professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford, with deep interests not only in mathematics, but philosophy of science. And I've done a lot of work over the years at the interface between science, philosophy, and theology. These days, because I'm locked down as a result of the coronavirus, I'm in the highly vulnerable category. But originally, I come from Northern Ireland a long time ago, studied at Cambridge, then went to the University of Wales for 25 years, and the remainder of the time has been at Oxford. And I'm now an emeritus professor and an emeritus fellow at Green Templeton College.
Wonderful. Now, we're going to look at one of your books. We're going to discuss one of your books, which I found fascinating. I've just finished reading it. I managed to get it on Kindle. And so I've been up late at night, lying in my bed, reading it. My wife's saying, "What are you reading now?" John Lennox, John Lennox. She says, "Oh, that's okay. That's okay." But there are one or two other, you've written several books. Can you tell us just about a couple of them?
Yeah, well, the first books I wrote were on mathematics, and they're irrelevant to our present conversation because
to me anyway, yes.
And me.
Advanced algebra is not a dining table topic unless you happen to be with a bunch of people working in that area. So forgetting those, the first serious book on the science religion field was called God's Undertaker Has Science Buried God? And that was 10 or 11 years ago. And I've been working at full speed in recent months, revising that from top to toe. And it will be republished next year under the title Has Science Buried God? Because we discovered that God's Undertaker doesn't translate well into other languages. So that was meant as an introduction to the whole debate between God and science. And then I wrote a second book because by that time I was beginning to get involved in pretty high profile debates with the likes of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. And I noticed that Hitchens was mainly using moral arguments against God. And I thought that might give me an opportunity to do something that was beyond the science-religion debate, but where I was able to tackle deep questions of the morality of Christianity, which is often, with people like Hitchens, regarded as absurd and all this kind of stuff. So I wrote a book called Gunning for God, which is a good title for an Irishman to have. And with its ambiguity, why the new atheists are missing the target. So that was the age of the new atheists, which is passé now because they're fading into the distance. And I've written several other books in between. My most recent activity has been to write a simpler and more accessible book on the science-God debate called Can Science Explain Everything? And I've been hugely encouraged by the response to that.
Yes, that's superb. That's superb, by the way. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have to say that your first book was hugely significant for me, so much so that it's one of those books that I have a copy ready to give to people because it was so helpful. And this second one that you've done is really, really helpful as well.
Well, I hope the revamp of the first book is going to be even more helpful because I didn't really know much about writing in the first book. And science has changed massively. And I think I've been able to, it's nearly finished, by the way, but an enormous amount of work. So there's that, and then Can Science Explain Everything? But before that, I wrote about God and Stephen Hawking. And since Stephen Hawking died not long ago, the publishers asked me to update it as a completed life. And so I put more of the stuff, it's about 30% longer now, in order to comment on Hawking's life, attitudes, philosophy as a completed life. And much more recently, I did a book, but I shouldn't mention it to a Presbyterian. I did a book called Determined to Believe, and the whole question of determinism.
Yes, now that's going to be for our theological podcast, because I was asked to write a review of it, and my review was going to end up being longer than the book. So I think we'll...
Well, you should write a book. But then the COVID pandemic, that immediately inspired me. Possibly because I'm a mathematician, I could see that this was going to grow exponentially around the world, and it would become quite scary. And so I sat down for a week of very intensive writing just to see if I could write anything that might open up possibilities for people to think about, putting it as modestly as that. In other words, I believe that Christianity is something to say, something non-trivial to say, something non-simplistic to say, and with the hope that people, thinking people, whether they're Christians or not, might gain something of understanding of how Christians approach these intractable problems, in a way, the hardest problem of all. So I wrote this little book called Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And it's been out for a couple of months, and it's in now 27 languages. And
I've only read it in one.
Yes, a lot of it has been distributed free over the internet to the large language groups, Chinese, Russian, Spanish, and South America, and so on.
That's great.
I've also been interested for many years in what it means to be human, which of course is a very important question for Christians to be involved in. But as time has gone by, and there's been increasing questioning about the nature of humanity, and with the advance in technology, what we can do to humanity in altering, say, the genetic structure of future generations with various add-ons to produce cyborgs and so on. The AI question came up, and I got into that because I was asked to do a lecture on it in London to a lot of leading people on that. And I said, no, I'm not the person to do that. And they said, well, we think you are, because we want something that we don't read really elsewhere, and that is how it relates to the biblical worldview. And I thought, no, I can't do that. And then I said, well, I read some stuff and see and consult some people who know about this. And I got utterly intrigued and worked. And the lecture turned into the book 2084, which Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity.
Yeah, which is wonderful. I mean, I have literally I finished it last night. I stayed up late last night to finish it. I want to introduce you to my colleague, Steve, before I ask you about AI. And again, you know, I do thank you for your books and your work. It's really, really appreciated. But I have no idea what Steve will ask you, but I'll censor it if it's not. So, Steve, have you got anything to ask your fellow countrymen?
Like fellow countrymen, yeah. Why write a book called Gunning for God? No, that's not right. A question about the AI one, because I'm intrigued. I haven't read it yet. The whole idea of the singularity, everything coming into sort of, you know, the way technology can bring everything together. And so one of the things I read was that the language used of that kind of AI was it was almost theological language. It was about hope and a future and lasting forever. Do you think that that whole movement sort of transposed theological language to sort of give it its own framework and hope? It sounds like it's sort of saying you can live forever.
Oh, exactly. That's one of the reasons I wrote my book. But I think we possibly need to start a little bit further back than that, because the kind of AI you're talking about is the second kind, the much more science fiction kind. That is artificial general intelligence. And we can come to definitions later if you like. But what struck me on reading books on this, and you mentioned particularly the search for hope, the search for everlasting physical life, and so on. These are topics addressed by Yuval Noah Harari in a best-selling book, multi-million selling book, Homo Deus. And I read that before I got into this stuff, and immediately I saw that this is a theological transposition. This is taking the longings of human beings at a deep level, both culturally, emotionally, spiritually, morally, and so on, and, so to speak, transposing them into the technological revolution that gives some people hope, an expectation of actually solving these problems. And therefore, for me, it was immediately related to Christianity in ways in which we can explore. But I think you've hit the nail on the head. And that is part of what's driving this stuff. It's the human longing for a solution to the future.
And also, isn't it the longing for to overcome death? So I was struck reading your book. I mean, I thought you would use That Hideous Strength, which for me was a profound book, which I think prophesied more or less 50 years before this all happened. But can I ask you about Harari's book? Because I've read Harari and I've personally found him so depressing. I mean, I just hopeless, godless, soulless. I mean, what was your reaction in reading Harari?
Well, very much like that. But being a good old Northern Irish optimist, I saw the opportunity of explaining Christianity by contrast with his views, because I do believe in Christianity we have the answer to. Now, to focus down, Harari's book talks about the future, and he says, look, there are two major agenda items for the 21st century. Number one, physical death is now simply a technical problem, which will be solved by technical means, which ultimately means that human beings won't need to die. They will be able to die, but they won't need to die. They can avoid death. And then secondly, what are we going to do with them? Well, what we're going to do with them is to enhance the level of human happiness. And that projects straight into the transhumanism idea. In other words, we're going to enhance happiness by re-engineering human beings genetically, all sorts of biological and technological add-ons, perhaps producing cyborgs, drug enhancement, and virtually everything that can be done should be done in order to increase his concept of human flourishing and happiness. These are the two big agenda items. And so it's eternal physical life he's after, and that mirrors a very ancient quest for the elixir of life, which I believe myself goes back to the biblical stories in Genesis.
Yeah, of
and
course.
Yes, I find it very depressing because it immediately occurred to me, and increasingly, that what he's hoping for is a pipe dream compared with what Christianity already offers. Yeah. And it's that business of the resurrection of Jesus and the promise of resurrection to all who follow and trust him, who have already received eternal life, is the ultimate answer to Harari's longing, and he knows absolutely nothing about it.
Exactly. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, John, as I think, because there's a comic book series, and it's a Netflix series too, called Altered Carbon, which deals with the question of, you know, you have these skins, these outer skins that you put your memory back into, and you can grow back again. Well, you're back again as you, you know. But the sin problem hasn't been solved. So the rich can do it well and the poor can't. And it looks more like Blade Runner than it does look like heaven, if that makes sense.
Well, I think you're making a hugely important differentiating point, because what Harari is talking about is very much differentiating in favor of the rich as against the poor.
Yeah.
And you just have to look at what already is being done by people who think that this will be achieved. Cryogenics, people putting themselves into cold storage in the hope that one day their brains will be uploadable onto some kind of silicon base and so on. That's vastly expensive stuff. And of course, the whole AI revolution raises deep questions about increasing the rich-poor divide in the world, because leaving many people unemployable because they don't have the wealth of technological knowledge to engage in new jobs.
John, can I ask you, and then I'll ask Steve to respond to this. In terms of AI, I mean, we've already established artificial intelligence, that there are different meanings of what that involves. I mean, in effect, speaking into this microphone or whatever, there's an element of artificial intelligence. I'm interested in the consciousness side of it, but before we come to that, can you tell us, are there any positive things about artificial intelligence?
Oh, hugely positive. And I think here we need to make the distinction. Narrow artificial intelligence, as it's now called, is the capacity of a system. Now, what is a system? A system consists of a lot of high-powered computing operating on a huge database and programmed in such a way to recognize certain specific types of patterns. Now, let me give you a simple example of that. X-rays. You take, let's say, 1 million X-rays of people's lungs. You get the world's top experts to label them with the diseases that they represent. There's your database. And your computer takes your X-ray as you feed it into the system, compares it with those 1 million X-rays, and then spits out a diagnosis. And on average, and increasingly so, that diagnosis will be much better than you get at your local hospital. So it becomes a hugely valuable diagnostic tool, because it puts at the disposal, in many different fields of medicine, it puts at the disposal of the average doctor the expertise of the world's top people. So here's a hugely positive thing. And then one thing I love to mention is the work of Rosalind Picard, who's a very brilliant woman heading up a department in MIT. She's a Christian, and she has developed a whole field on her own called affective computing. And what she's using that for instance, is using facial recognition, AI technology, to focus on the movements of the faces of children who are liable to fits, seizures, autistic episodes, and various things like that. And it's got predictive power so that they can actually rescue these children by seeing in advance the signs of one of these things happening. And there are spin-offs in equipment that she has developed that are saving people's lives. Now, this is all vastly impressive. And one thing I wrote my book in order to do was to demystify the good side of AI, so that instead of Christians having a very superficial reaction and thinking, oh, that's summoning the demon, as I think it was Stephen Hawking or Elon Musk or somebody like that said, they realize that there's a positive side. But let me emphasize again, narrow AI is the capacity of a system to do one specific thing that normally requires human intelligence. And here it's important to say that the words used, artificial intelligence, are not saying that the system is intelligent. They're saying that the system can do something the result of which looks as if or could have been done by human intelligence. There's a wonderful paper written in 1985 by one of the early people in this field who also happens to be a believer. Dr. Mellichamp is a marvelous name. I've met him. And he wrote this paper or gave a talk entitled "The Artificial in Artificial Intelligence is Real." And that exactly captures what's going on. And terminology matters, because the difficulty is a lot of it is highly anthropomorphic. And it leads people to think, well, if you're talking about artificial intelligence, well, clearly, ultimately, you'll make a machine that's really intelligent.
Yeah.
And of course, that's highly misleading because, and here I come back to your initial remark, David, a moment ago, it stumbles on the huge barrier of the nature of human consciousness.
Yeah. Can we come to that? I'm going to ask Steve to pick up on, to ask you something with that. I mean, I do think it's important that Christians are not automatically assumed to be knee-jerk Luddites or to be those people who just accept things. But Steve, do you want to come in with something?
Yeah, and I think what as I'm hearing that, I'm going that the Christian can fall into the fear of it, and then there's a flip side that people fall into the salvation side of it. And I think it's probably true that our understanding of transcendence, when we believe that there's something more than what we can see, is a good safety brake on our expectations of what AI might achieve for us, because it seems like everything in AI at an imaginative level for the science fiction writer or the person saying where it could go is, how can I keep this thing here going as long as possible without any interruption, without dying, without, all these sorts of things. But if you have a bigger view of that, the Christian framework gives you this can be a good tool, but a terrible master, if that would make sense.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And the point is that the ethical problems are already with us in narrow AI. It's very important for people to realize that ethical issues don't just start with the futuristic scenarios that probably won't come to pass, in my view, but they're certainly being thought about. Because take, for instance, the fact that many of us voluntarily, interestingly, wear a tracker device called a smartphone. And we also voluntarily use that smartphone, say, to buy David Robertson's latest book. And
that's a good idea.
A few days later, we'll get a little pop-up saying, people that bought this book bought that book by George Lennox, you see. And of course, nobody will buy George Lennox's book. But the point is, that is artificial intelligence creating a database which involves all that I've bought in terms of books, but also contains virtually all the books there are. It is a colossal database, so that it sifts through, noting my preferences and the pattern recognition. It does the one single thing again, and that is it picks out a book that might be suitable for me. So far, so good. I usually ignore those pop-ups. But what many people don't realize is that we're also voluntarily giving the system all kinds of additional information that can be fed into other AI systems, such as where we go, GPS trackers, who we meet, and if it's eavesdropping on our phone, who we talk to, what we say, all this kind of stuff. And that is being sold on. There's a huge commercial enterprise there. And the significant book is by Shoshana Zuboff, who's a retired professor at MIT. And her book has the title Surveillance Capitalism. And she points out that this is a very serious development, that our information, which is our intellectual property, is being sold on without our knowledge, and vast amounts of money are being made on it. without saying anything about the ethical problems of the surveillance that it can lead to.
Is
So
that interesting?
there's a huge issue.
Yeah, that's interesting that we, you know, Stalin would have given his right arm for that amount of surveillance, but it's not government that we're actually giving most of our information to about the deep things in our lives. It's corporations, isn't it?
Unless you're Chinese.
Yeah.
Unless you're Chinese. And that unless is extremely important.
Yeah.
Because coming on to the Chinese, I call it surveillance communism, what's happening among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China, where the surveillance techniques have been taken to almost absurd proportions. Hundreds of millions of closed-circuit TV cameras, people being stopped in the street every kilometer or less, their smartphones taken away, read by machinery, put into a vast database. Yeah. And if people don't accord with the norms set up by the ruling society, many of them are ending up in what look very much like concentration camps. And the point of the difference was made in a very interesting, I think it was Time magazine a year or two ago, saying, we in the West need to look out, and this was written by a Chinese observer, because all the technology that is being used in the East to monitor people is available in the West. The only difference being it's not under central government control, but that could rapidly happen. And in London, not long ago, one of the heads of the police said, this is what we need to control.
Yeah, and states will always look for that. John, I'm deeply conscious that our time is basically going, and I do want to ask you about the consciousness thing, but I want to cite you an article in The Guardian, because I'm still keeping in touch with the UK, you know, and it's entitled Sex, Robots and Vegan Meat. And it describes in a factory, part of it, in San Marcos, near San Diego in California, that there are a group of AI experts who are developing a new brand of woman that can smile, flutter her eyelids, make small talk, remember the name of your siblings. And this is not just a sex doll, although that's included. This really is the Stepford Wives stuff. Now, I want to conflate these two questions together. First of all, I think that's horrible. But secondly, it's such a, you know, I would love to give you an hour to answer this question. But can you imagine a robot ever attaining consciousness? And, you know, what would be, for people who fear that, or for people who want it, who think that our consciousness is really just chemicals?
That's a huge question.
I know.
Put in the way you've put it, can you imagine? The answer to that is no. And the reason for that is that we don't know what consciousness is. And since we don't know what consciousness is, and I'm not saying I don't know what it is, we don't know. The leading people working on consciousness, and I've read a great deal about it, I've even written about it, they don't know what it is. So until we know what it is, it forms a huge barrier. We have simply no idea what constitutes, how we would describe a conscious thought. And although science has made vast progress, until we can do that, there's no way of mimicking real intelligence. It's going to remain artificial and partial. And of course, there are voices that are saying it will happen. You mentioned the singularity. Kurzweil thinks this thing will happen. It's usually within 30 years. When you ask at any particular time, it's always 30 years hence it will happen.
It's like your renovation's always 2 weeks away from being finished.
Yes, that's right. The goalposts are shifting. But David, in answer to your question, I'm very happy to do a second session.
Well, do you know, can we, I'm going to say goodbye here, and then I'm going to come back because I want to follow the consciousness thing and look at it a bit more. Can I thank you so much for being willing to speak to us here in Australia? It's good to see you looking so well. I wondered if you'd had any AI or Botox or something, because you look much younger than I remember you. You're
yes,
looking good.
It's amazing what the loss of a few kilos can do. But let me say, it's always a delight to be in Australia, either literally or virtually. I have such happy memories of my visit around your country. Thank you very much for having me on and sitting at your dining table.